The morning air was sharp with frost, biting at exposed skin and stiffening fingers as the young pilot stepped onto the tarmac, the soles of his boots crunching over a mixture of ice and grit. The sky hung heavy and gray, clouds low enough to scrape the tops of the distant hangars, promising turbulence and erratic winds that would complicate every maneuver. He paused beside the aircraft and had become a legend in its own right, though not for any feats of daring. To the veterans around him, it was a cursed machine, a plane that had claimed more pilots than it had victories. Its aluminum skin was scratched and dented, rivets pitted from previous repairs, the paint dulled and streaked with streaks of oil and grime. Every line of the fuselage spoke of long days of mechanical stress. Every panel, a reminder of the plane's temperamental history. He ran gloved hands along the wings, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingers, tracing the uneven seams where replacement panels had been riveted in haste. The hydraulics hissed faintly as he cycled the control surfaces, the ailerons responding sluggishly, each movement reminding him that he would not have the luxury of flawless performance in the skies. The landing gear, already worn with repeated takeoffs and landings on hastily prepared strips, gave an almost imperceptible creak as he manipulated the levers. It was a plane that demanded attention to every detail, a craft that would punish carelessness without hesitation. The young pilot knew this, and yet he could not let the whispers of doubt around him take root in his own mind. He straightened, checking his reflection in the scratched canopy glass, the faint condensation blurring the contours of his helmeted face, and took a deep breath, drawing the cold air into lungs already tight with anticipation. Around him, the veterans observed quietly, their eyes sharp, measuring. One older pilot, face lined from years of sun and frost, adjusted his scarf and stepped closer, not offering guidance but a watchful evaluation. He lingered over the same areas the young pilot had already noted, the rivets along the fuselage seam, the slight misalignment of the rudder pedals, the fraying of the throttle cable. Each veteran carried the weight of countless sorties, the ghosts of men who had never returned, their experiences etched into the careful scrutiny of every plane that entered the squadron. The young pilot could feel their gaze as though it pressed against his chest, weighing not only the plane but him as a man entrusted to wield it. He understood that rank and training meant little here. Respect would be earned in the air or not at all. He ran through the pre-flight checklist, each step methodical, deliberate. Instruments were inspected, pressure gauges calibrated, fuel lines tapped to ensure flow. The vibrations of the idling engine echoed in his chest through the fuselage, a low, steady reminder that this machine had life, but one that required constant negotiation. Every hum and rattle carried a potential warning, a note that would demand attention if ignored. Outside, the wind tugged at the wings, bending the thin aluminum in ways that made him conscious of fragility and resilience coexisting in the same structure. He stepped back to observe, tilting his head to catch the subtle curvature of the fuselage, the panel seams that ran like scars across the body, and the slight twist in the stabilizer that would challenge precision in flight. The sky offered no comfort. The gray overcast stretched endlessly, promising gusts and patches of turbulence that would amplify every fault the plane possessed. It was the kind of theater that tested not just skill, but nerve and composure under pressure. The young pilot allowed himself a moment to study the horizon, noting the wind-driven clouds and the shifting shadows across the snow-laden fields below. His stomach tightened with both anticipation and unease. He had trained for this, studied the aircraft's quirks in manuals and simulations, but no preparation could fully replicate the feel of an untrusted plane beneath hands that had yet to know its temperament intimately. Every veteran in the squadron had already experienced that moment when a control surface responded just slightly differently than expected, when a motor hiccup became a near catastrophe. He climbed into the cockpit, settling into the seat with measured caution that disguised his nerves. The leather straps of the harness bit into his shoulders, warm but secure, the helmet snug and familiar despite the slight chill that seeped through the canopy. He ran fingers over the throttle, the stick, the switches, each textured surface a reminder of purpose and responsibility. Around him, the veterans maintained their silent scrutiny. None offered reassurance, not because they were cruel, but because the judgment of the air was absolute and impartial. It did not tolerate mistakes, and it respected neither age nor rank. The plane beneath him had been a vessel of doubt for months, carrying the whispered concerns of every pilot who had flown and survived, or not flown and never returned. The young pilot adjusted his oxygen mask and gloves, feeling the faint vibration of the idling engine reverberate to the cockpit floor. He could hear the faint whine of hydraulic pressure, the subtle groan of metal settling under its own stress. Outside, the wind tugged at the rudder, and the plane shifted slightly in the cold gusts. He breathed in, consciously steadying both mind and body. It was a delicate negotiation between machine and man, between inherited fear and personal determination. The air around the tarmac was sharp, tinged with oil and snow, carrying the distant echoes of engines warming and the occasional clatter of tools from ground crews. The veteran's eyes tracked his every movement as he worked the controls, noting posture, method, and hesitation. Every small adjustment, every nod or subtle tension in his shoulders was being cataloged. Trust in this environment was not given. It was painstakingly observed, measured in competence under stress, in the ability to maintain calm when the unexpected arrived. He understood this with a clarity born of both fear and resolve. Rank meant nothing. Confidence alone was fragile, a candle flame easily extinguished in the gusting winds of uncertainty. What mattered now was precision, discipline, and the quiet assertion of control over a plane that had earned the reputation of failure. Finally, as the pre-flight inspection concluded, the young pilot exhaled slowly, allowing himself the barest trace of relief. The engine roared to life with a growl that shook the fuselage, a declaration that despite its flaws, the plane could still fly, and that he would fly it. He felt the vibrations through his hands on the stick, the tactile conversation between pilot and machine beginning. Outside, the veterans remained composed but watchful, their faces unreadable masks of experience. The young pilot understood their silence not as condemnation, but as a space in which he would prove himself. Every ounce of skepticism, every shadow of doubt, was now a part of the air he would slice through, a weight he would bear alongside the cold metal beneath him and the gray sky above. And so, with the throttle engaged, the nose lifting slightly as the wheels held against the tarmac, he prepared to take flight. The plane, untrusted and scarred, waited beneath him like a beast coiled, its quirks and dangers intimate and unforgiving. In that quiet, tense moment before the first roll forward, he realized that his measure would not be in words, nor in the nods of veterans, but in the air itself, in the dance of speed, altitude, and control that would test skill, nerve, and courage to their limits. The cockpit, the plane, and the sky had become the proving ground, and the young pilot's journey had only just begun. The engines thrummed beneath him, a low vibration that coursed through the rudder pedals and control stick, reminding him with every pulse that the plane was alive and unpredictable. As the young pilot taxied down the icy runway, he felt the subtle flex of the aluminum wings under the weight of frost and frost-laden wind, each panel creaking faintly with the temperature shift. The older pilots observed from the sidelines, their arms folded, eyes narrowed, lips pressed in thin lines that conveyed judgment without a word. The runway stretched before him like a narrow strip of promise and peril, and each second of acceleration amplified the scrutiny. He had studied the aircraft, memorized its quirks, traced every rivet and seam, but theory had little weight against the actual vibrations, the subtle resistances in the stick, and the tremor of the landing gear as it pressed against frozen concrete. As he lifted into the gray skies, the clouds clinging like damp wool to the horizon, the first signs of imperfection appeared. The engine coughed, a stutter that made the control surfaces hesitate by fractions of a second, and the plane lurched with an unexpected twitch. His stomach tightened, a reminder of both inexperience and the machine's temper. He countered immediately, adjusting the throttle, nudging the stick with measured pressure, coaxing responsiveness from reluctant hydraulics. The aircraft answered gradually, reluctant but obedient, and a tense relief coursed through him. In the distance, the horizon seemed to shift unnaturally, a gray expanse blending clouds and smoke, and he reminded himself to ignore distractions. Concentration was his shield, precision his only ally. The first mission carried both the burden of scrutiny and the practical demands of aerial navigation. He plotted the course mentally, cross-checking compass readings against the faint terrain below, every shadow of a hill or rise in the frozen earth carrying the potential to mislead. Small deviations caused him to recalibrate repeatedly, the plane's quirks amplifying minor errors, a slight lag in aileron response, a yaw that required subtle rudder compensation, a stubborn throttle that refused linear compliance. Each correction felt like a negotiation with a partner that refused trust. The sky above was layered with turbulence, and the wind shifted unexpectedly, tugging at wings and fuselage in ways that made the horizon tilt and wobble. He adjusted instinctively, drawing on hours of simulated training. Yet every correction was shadowed by the silent, invisible presence of the veteran pilots who followed in formation, their judgmental eyes invisible but heavy in its weight. Intermittent enemy sightings tested his nerves more directly. Far off, a formation of aircraft glinted faintly against the overcast sky, sunlight bouncing on aluminum and glass like distant, dangerous sparks. The young pilot's heart hammered, but he forced control to his hands, mind compartmentalizing fear into calculation. He maneuvered, noting enemy positions, engine responses, and the plane's stability, all while maintaining the course demanded by the mission. In moments of sudden turbulence or minor mechanical hesitation, he had to recalibrate mentally, juggling the aircraft's limitations against the imperatives of engagement. He felt the subtle shift of the rudder under his feet, the stick vibrating with tension, the air pressure pressing unevenly against the fuselage, a reminder that the machine could betray him with a single misjudgment. Communication was limited and sporadic. The radio crackled with static, delivering partial instructions or delayed confirmations from squadron command. Each garbled message heightened the sense of isolation, forcing him to make small decisions independently, trusting instinct and training over guidance. The veterans monitored silently, noting how he responded to uncertainty. Every minor hesitation, every deliberate adjustment, was recorded in unspoken evaluation. Their eyes, keen and unyielding, searched for signs of competence and faltering alike. The young pilot understood that respect would not be immediate, that earning trust in this theater required the quiet accumulation of skill under pressure rather than any gesture or declaration. The weather layered further complexity over operational stress. Clouds thickened, winds shifted suddenly, and a patch of fog reduced visibility to only a few hundred meters. Each adjustment required rapid recalibration, subtle banking, throttle compensation, and constant eye on instruments. The plane responded with varying compliance, the rudder catching slightly, a wing flexing under gust, and he felt every tremor in his hands and feet. Engine sputters punctuated the tense atmosphere intermittently, making him tighten his grip on the controls. Every action had consequences. A slight overcorrection could induce a spin. A misjudged ascent could lead to collision with cloud-enshrouded terrain below. The sky itself seemed to challenge him, testing not only technical skill but psychological endurance. A minor mechanical issue forced a hasty adjustment mid-flight. One of the instruments displayed erratic readings, a gauge flickering with uncertainty. He responded methodically, checking secondary indicators, adjusting throttle, and recalibrating based on tactile feedback rather than absolute certainty. Each micro-decision carried amplified weight. The plane's temperament demanded careful attention, and any miscalculation would be visible not only to the environment but to the observing veterans. He noted the plane's subtle behaviors, the way a control surface shifted resistance in cold air, the faint vibration in the wings under sudden maneuvering, and used them to predict responses. It was a delicate balance between intuition, observation, and decisiveness, and he felt the quiet tension of a man learning the boundaries of trust in both machine and comrades. Enemy encounters, though brief, were psychologically taxing. Faint silhouettes, glinting metal, and the sound of distant engines provoked an immediate focus. He maneuvered with care, tracking formations while maintaining course and formation discipline. The plane shuddered with each sharp turn, control surfaces protesting with squeals and subtle lags. Yet each successful adjustment reinforced the fragile confidence he was cultivating. The veteran's silence persisted, a pressure that could have unseated any hesitation. Their approval, unspoken, was contingent on observable skill and composure, not the optimistic hope of a young pilot. By the end of the sorties, he returned to base physically drained and mentally tense. His hands were stiff from gripping controls, fingers numb from the cold and constant correction, and sweat had mingled with frost and grime across his face. The aircraft, once feared and dismissed, had responded to careful attention, instinct, and persistent correction, surviving the flight without catastrophic failure. The veterans approached quietly, noting the plane's state, the pilot's posture, and the careful maintenance of composure. Though approval was not openly expressed, there was acknowledgement in the absence of critique, in the measured nods and the lowered brows that suggested observation and cautious respect. The young pilot stepped down from the cockpit, allowing a moment for air to fill his lungs without the mechanical vibrations echoing through his body. He felt the weight of the flight settle into bones, a tangible reminder of both accomplishment and vulnerability. Minor mechanical quirks, atmospheric challenges, and intermittent threats had been navigated successfully, yet the journey toward earning trust was ongoing. The veteran's skepticism lingered like a shadow across the tarmac, reminding him that mastery required repetition, endurance, and the unrelenting demonstration of competence in the unforgiving theater of aerial warfare. The plane, scarred yet obedient, waited silently, a partner in cautious trust for missions to come. The sky erupted into a mosaic of smoke, sunlight, and movement as the young pilot pressed the throttle forward, feeling the vibrations of the plane reverberate through his chest and up his arms. Around him, wingmen were scattered by the sudden maneuvering of enemy formations, engines screaming, metal glinting in harsh shaft of light that broke through the dense cloud cover. Each aircraft was alive with danger, each trajectory calculated in fractions of a second, and every decision carried immediate consequences. The young pilot's mind raced even as his hands worked instinctively, nudging rudder pedals, adjusting throttle, and coaxing the reluctant hydraulics to respond to sharp banking maneuvers. The untrusted plane, once a source of whispered doubt, was now a partner in survival, its quirks and idiosyncrasies familiar enough to predict and exploit. The first burst of tracers ripped past the cockpit, a harsh staccato of fire and light that painted shadows across his face. The canopy rattled under distant hits, and the vibration of the fuselage shifted subtly with each near strike. He felt the pulse of adrenaline tighten muscles, sharpen vision, and accelerate thought. Enemy aircraft approached from angles he had not anticipated, forcing him to assess multiple threats at once, prioritize maneuvers, and make instant decisions with no margin for error. Wingmen screamed to the radio, voices fragmented by static and the roar of engines, giving partial coordinates and last-moment warnings. The young pilot absorbed each fragment, translated into action, and adjusted controls to maintain formation cohesion while evading hostile fire. The plane shuddered as he executed a sharp bank, control surfaces protesting, metal creaking under stress. The engine stuttered briefly under the strain, forcing a delicate modulation of the throttle to keep the aircraft from lurching. A brief misalignment in rudder response nearly sent him into a rapid spin, but instinct and knowledge of the plane's temperament allowed him to compensate in time. His stomach knotted, hands burned from gripping the stick, but the mental clarity sharpened with focus. Every twitch of the stick, every flicker in the engine panel, was a conversation between pilot and machine. He knew precisely how much force to apply, how to anticipate the delay in response, and how to maximize maneuverability without exceeding the limits of the metal under him. Enemy fighters converged from unexpected angles, forcing evasive rolls and dives that tore across cloud layers. Each maneuver was a calculated risk. A single misjudged turn could separate him from the squadron or expose him to concentrated fire. The young pilot adjusted continuously, reading not just instruments, but the subtle vibrations and micro-responses of the plane itself. He noted each lag in hydraulic response, each shudder of the airframe under rapid pitch changes, and adapted instantly. In the periphery of his vision, he saw wingmen struggling to maintain formation, some veering into turbulence, others diving abruptly to evade fire. His quick, decisive maneuvers became a stabilizing force, providing paths for others to follow, subtle cues that preserved cohesion in the chaotic ballet above the clouds. Communications faltered as static choked the radio, voices breaking in and out with erratic consistency. Orders from higher command were delayed, fragmented, or contradictory, leaving the young pilot to rely on judgment rather than instruction. The weight of responsibility pressed against his shoulders, heavier than the harness and heavier than the aluminum beneath him. He had to decide, conserve the aircraft in retreat or press forward and risk both material and human loss. His instincts, honed through hours of observation and training, compelled him to push onward. He adjusted flaps and ailerons with precision, anticipating wind currents and enemy positioning, nudging the throttle to maximize both speed and stability. Each micro-decision preserved not only his life, but the fragile coherence of the squadron, earning small, silent recognition from the watching veterans in real time. The plane shuddered under repeated stress, rivets quivering as they absorbed strain from violent banking and dive maneuvers. Panels flexed and wings vibrated. But the aircraft held together, responding to every calculated input. The young pilot leaned forward in the seat, jaw tight, eyes scanning the rapidly shifting horizon. Clouds became both cover and obstacle, turbulence twisting air currents unpredictably. He traced the patterns, anticipating where enemy aircraft would attempt to intercept or flank, and positioned both himself and the squadron advantageously. Risk and reward balanced delicately in the same seconds. A slightly sharper dive could avoid fire. A misjudged roll could invite disaster. Every movement demanded total commitment. Every decision tested nerve, skill, and calm under pressure. Minutes stretched like hours as the engagement intensified. Flashes of enemy tracer rounds lit the interior of the cockpit, reflections bouncing off dial's glass, and the young pilot's own sweat-streaked face. His breathing became measured despite the surge of adrenaline, conscious control of lungs, and focus, sustaining cognitive clarity. Wingmen followed the cues from his maneuvers, a subtle choreography built on instinct and observation, keeping the squadron aligned even as individual planes deviated to avoid fire. The young pilot's authority emerged quietly but undeniably, his decisions precise, his timing impeccable, his skill evident not in words but in outcomes. The veterans, silent observers, and participants alike recognized it through observation, through the unspoken acknowledgement that the plane and pilot had survived, guided the formation, and executed tactical choices that preserved lives. Mechanical quirks tested him at the worst moments. The engine occasionally sputtered under sudden throttle demands, rudder response lagged slightly during tight turns, and control sometimes resisted until nudged precisely. Each anomaly forced rapid problem-solving, improvisation, and a balance between caution and aggression. He compensated with micro-adjustments, maintaining both offensive potential and defensive safety. Awareness extended beyond the cockpit. He noted enemy aircraft positions, calculated relative speed, and anticipated maneuvers in a rhythm that blended technical mastery with instinctive judgment. Each success built cumulative trust, bridging the gap between inexperience and demonstrated competence. By the end of sustained engagement, the young pilot's body ached from strain, his hands raw from constant control input, his eyes burned from smoke and sunlight reflected off metal. Yet the plane, battered but functional, remained aloft, its scars testament to its survival and to his skill. The squadron, once doubtful, now maintained formation with subtle cohesion, guided by his decisions. The veterans' faces, previously marked with measured skepticism, showed the faint acknowledgement of earned respect. A nod, a brief glance, the relaxation of tense shoulders. The young pilot exhaled slowly, absorbing the quiet wave of authority and the first tangible measure of trust earned under fire. Returning to base, the plane's wings carried both battle marks and proof of survival. Every rivet stressed, every panel flexed, and every engine tremor had been negotiated with precision, judgment, and courage. The young pilot had transformed the skeptic's doubt into recognition, his competence under pressure becoming the silent standard by which his place among the veterans was now measured. He stepped from the cockpit, body trembling with fatigue but steady in resolve, aware that trust had been granted not through age or rank, but through skill, decision, and the capacity to hold calm when chaos reigned above the clouds. The trial by fire was complete, and the measure of a pilot had shifted irrevocably in the eyes of those he now quietly commanded. The tarmac was silent but for the faint hum of engines winding down, the residual vibrations still shaking through the cold morning air. The young pilot guided the plane to a stop, feeling every shudder and twitch as he brought it gently to rest. The aluminum skin bore the scars of battle, punctured panels, scorched streaks, and the faint charred tracer fire along the fuselage. Yet, amidst the damage were the unmistakable symbols of achievement. White kill marks carefully painted along the side, each one representing an enemy aircraft felled in the maelstrom of the engagement. The plane that had been dismissed, distrusted, and whispered about among the veterans now stood as evidence of endurance and skill, a tangible reflection of the pilot's capability under pressure. He climbed down from the cockpit slowly, muscles stiff from tension and fatigue, the cold biting through his flight suit and gloves. His helmet, scratched and streaked with soot and sweat, was removed to reveal a face pale from concentration, but resolute in its composure. The veterans, who had watched every inspection, every maneuver, every heartbeat of the aircraft, now approached with a quiet deliberation that carried more weight than any words could. Their eyes, once sharp with skepticism, lingered on him with an acknowledgment that was measured and deliberate. Respect, once withheld, had been earned through action, through precision, and through the unspoken courage displayed in the chaos above the clouds. The plane's imperfections were obvious: a slightly misaligned rudder, wing flaps showing strain, and panels that had bulged under stress. Yet each flaw was contextualized by its survival and the mastery displayed in flight. The young pilot ran his gloved fingers along the fuselage, noting each dent and scratch, but seeing in them not failure, but testimony to resilience and competence. The veterans followed silently, observing his inspection, reading posture and method as a demonstration of understanding and responsibility. It was a language of action rather than speech. The plane and pilot together spoke of endurance and skill more clearly than any conversation ever could. Around the airfield, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. The tension that had clung to the squadron like frost in the mornings had eased into a steady rhythm. Mechanics and ground crews moved with a measured pace, their work reflecting both relief and cautious pride. The young pilot's landing had restored a degree of stability to unit, reinforcing confidence in both him and the once-doubted aircraft. Eyes that had once lingered with suspicion now followed his movements with careful attention, gauging his approach to maintenance, his careful debriefing, and the composure with which he navigated post-flight procedures. Leadership had been demonstrated not through authority or rank, but through consistent, capable action under extreme stress. He paused beside the plane, examining the kill marks that streaked the fuselage like tallying victories on the body of the machine itself. Each mark was a reminder of decisions made in seconds, of split-second judgments that had preserved both aircraft and squad cohesion. The weight of those moments pressed quietly in his chest. Not pride in the sense of ego, but a sober acknowledgement of responsibility, of survival, and of the lives entrusted to his judgment. Around him, veterans exchanged glances, subtle and unspoken, an acknowledgement of skill and courage that did not need articulation. Respect had become tangible, woven into the rhythm of the squadron, embedded in the shared understanding of what had transpired in the sky above. He walked along the wings, noting small mechanical adjustments made during flight, subtle quirks in the ailerons, and the slight unevenness of the landing gear under load. Each observation was deliberate, methodical, and precise, revealing both attention to detail and an understanding of the plane's limitations. The veterans observed from just beyond reach, their stance relaxed yet attentive, their silent scrutiny now tempered with trust. The plane, once considered unreliable, had become an extension of his skill and judgment, a tool through which competence was demonstrated and recognized. The tension between skepticism and respect had shifted definitively toward acknowledgement. As he reached the tail, the young pilot traced his hand along the surface, noting minor chafing from turbulence and the subtle curvature that had flexed under maneuvering stress. The kill marks glinted faintly in the low morning light, each one a testament not to recklessness, but a calculated risk and disciplined control. He allowed himself a quiet breath, not a triumph, but of measured satisfaction. The mission was complete, and the proof of capability was written not in words, but in performance, in the survival of both machine and men, and in the preservation of unit cohesion under the most trying circumstances. The veterans now approached fully, nods exchanged in a language of experience and tacit approval. Their expressions carried the weight of acknowledgement. A faint lifting of eyebrows, a steadying of posture, and a slight softening of the line of the jaw that had often been firm with doubt. They observed the young pilot's methodical inspection, his careful handling of the plane, and the calm authority that now emanated quietly from his movements. It was an authority earned, visible in consistency of action, in the decisiveness of judgment, and in composure displayed when the unexpected threatened to unbalance both aircraft and pilot. The balance of skepticism and respect had been recalibrated, a subtle but unshakable shift in perception. He stepped back from the plane, allowing the veterans to approach, their eyes scanning panels, flaps, and control surfaces. Their analysis was silent but precise, a review of both performance and outcomes. The young pilot stood beside the aircraft, observing as their expressions evolved from cautious evaluation to quiet acknowledgement. In their measured silence, there was approval, the recognition of skill, judgment, and composure that had transformed him from a figure of doubt into a point of reference for trust within the squadron. The plane, scarred but intact, was both witness and instrument in this transformation. The squadron's cohesion had been subtly reinforced. Wingmen who had watched his maneuvers with skepticism now followed his guidance without hesitation, their respect grounded in observed competence rather than rank or age. Small gestures, a nod, a glance, the willingness to coordinate maneuvers without prompting, revealed the emergence of trust, forged not in speeches or ceremony, but in the precise execution of responsibility under pressure. The young pilot felt the weight of this unspoken acknowledgement, recognizing that leadership in action was as much about restraint and reliability as it was about bold decision-making. As the engines cooled and the airfield settled into routine, the young pilot allowed himself a moment of reflection. The plane, battered yet serviceable, stood as a testament to both survival and mastery. The kill marks along its side reflected not bravado, but the disciplined choices and measured risks that had preserved lives and preserved trust. The veterans, once observers and critics, now regarded him with the quiet admiration that only competence under duress can earn. He understood that this was the true measure, not age, not rank, not inherited reputation, but the capacity to act decisively, responsibly, and consistently when circumstances demanded it. The day concluded with a sense of resolution that was sober rather than celebratory. There were no overt declarations of triumph, no exaggerated gestures, only the subtle, shared acknowledgement that capability had been demonstrated, trust earned, and unit cohesion strengthened. The young pilot, having navigated both the literal and psychological turbulence of the engagement, had established his place among seasoned veterans, not through force of personality, but through measured, competent action under extreme pressure. The plane, once distrusted and dismissed, had returned as both instrument and proof, its scars a record of survival, endurance, and skill.